I thought I was spending Friday evening alone with reheated soup and an old movie, because my daughter had texted me at 4 in the afternoon to say dinner was off. Everyone was exhausted. Maybe next weekend. So sorry, Mom. I had set the table for one, poured myself a glass of Chardonnay that somehow tasted like disappointment even before I lifted it to my lips, and told myself, with the practiced patience of a woman who has spent 27 years loving her daughter, through every inconvenience and cancellation and forgotten plan, that these things happen. Families get busy. It wasn't personal. It was just life. I had turned the television on to something I'd already seen twice and pulled the quilt from the back of the sofa and told myself the evening would pass quickly enough. Then my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a push notification from my credit card app. One of those small blue alerts that usually showed up for grocery stores and gas stations, the kind I barely ever stopped to read. But this one said, "Charge approved. $47.50. Marcello's Italian Bistro." I stared at those words for a long, suspended moment, the way you stare at something that doesn't yet make sense, but is beginning to. Marcello's was the restaurant I had personally called 3 days ago to make reservations for the family dinner that had just been canceled. I had booked a table for 6. I had even called ahead to ask about the salmon special my daughter loved. The card had exactly 2 authorized users in the world, me and Cassie. Dinner had not been canceled at all. It had simply been canceled for me. To understand what that notification did to me, truly did to me, in the deep and irreversible way that certain discoveries do, you have to understand what I had built in the 4 years since my divorce from Gerald, and how much of that building had been done in the deliberate, effortful name of keeping my daughter close. The divorce had been brutal in the way that long, quiet unhappiness finally is when it breaks all at once. Gerald and I had been married for 23 years, and by the end we were 2 people sharing a house, a mortgage, and a last name, but not much else. 2 people who had run out of things to say so gradually that neither of us had noticed the exact moment the conversation stopped. When it finally ended, Cassie, who was 23 at the time, had been angry in the way that adult children of divorce sometimes are, furious at the disruption, furious at the loss of the family she had always assumed would be permanent, afraid in a way she couldn't fully name. For a while, I had been genuinely afraid that she would take her father's side and I would lose her too. But she hadn't. She'd come back to me slowly, cautiously, the way animals do after a storm, and we had rebuilt something between us that felt, in time, genuinely good, better than good. Honest in a way the years of keeping the peace hadn't always been. She had married Tyler Drummond 2 years after the divorce at a small ceremony held in the garden of the house I had bought for myself after the settlement, a 3-bedroom craftsman on Birchwood Lane with a deep front porch and a vegetable garden in the back and a screened-in sitting area where I had spent many of my best evenings since. The house was mine. I had bought it with my own money. The money from 20 years of working as a contracts manager at Hartwell & Sons, carefully saved, carefully argued for in mediation, while Gerald's attorney tried to convince the room that my contributions to our shared life had been worth less than I knew them to be. The house represented something I couldn't fully articulate, but felt every time I walked through the front door. I was still here. I had survived something I hadn't been sure I could survive. I had made something beautiful with my own hands, on my own terms. Tyler was pleasant enough, Quiet, professionally competent, with a firm handshake, and a habit of pulling out his phone during long conversations that I had decided charitably to interpret as shyness rather than rudeness. His mother, Brenda Drummond, was 61, recently widowed, with silver hair she wore in a precise, blunt cut, and a talent for making herself comfortable in rooms she hadn't been invited to inhabit. She had a way of touching Tyler's arm when she spoke to him that struck me, the first time I noticed it, as less like a mother's reassurance and more like a claim, a subtle but unmistakable marking of territory. Her smile was wide and warm and stopped precisely at her eyes, like a frame around a picture that had nothing behind it. She used the phrase, "we're family," the way other people use punctuation, frequently, instinctively, and without it appearing to mean very much at all. But Cassie was happy. Tyler made Cassie happy. And after everything, the divorce, the rebuilding, the slow and careful return to something like ease between us, that was what mattered. I had done everything in my power to be the kind of mother-in-law I had wished I'd had, welcoming, warm, genuinely unobtrusive. 8 months ago, at Cassie's request, I had added her as an authorized user on my Hartwell credit card, the one I used for larger purchases, the one that accumulated reward points I had always vaguely planned to use someday for Portugal. "Just for emergencies," Cassie had said, sitting across from me at this very kitchen table with a coffee mug cradled in both hands and an expression of casual, easy affection. "Tyler's card gets declined abroad sometimes, and we're planning Barcelona in the spring. It would just be good to have a backup, you know? I'll only ever use it if something goes wrong." I had said yes without hesitating, because she was my daughter, because I trusted her completely, and because after the divorce and the rebuilding and the slow and fragile return to genuine ease between us, the thought of refusing her something so small felt impossible, like placing a stone in the path of something I had spent years coaxing back to life. The warning signs were visible, in retrospect, as far back as January. At the time, I explained every single one of them away with the generous, willful blindness that mothers learn to practice toward the children they love too much to see clearly. In January, there had been a charge for $83 at a restaurant I didn't recognize. On a weekend, Cassie had told me she and Tyler were staying in to work on their taxes. I had texted her about it. She responded within minutes. "Oh my gosh, totally forgot. We ended up going out after all. I'll pay you back." She did not pay me back that week or the week after, and I eventually let it go because $83 felt too small to be worth the conversation it would require. The conversation where I'd have to say carefully that the card was for emergencies, and she would feel accused, and I would feel like my own mother, who had kept a running ledger of every cent she'd ever spent on her children and produced it at moments of conflict like a weapon. I had spent 20 years deciding I would not be that woman. In February, a charge appeared from Spa Botanica, $212, Cassie's birthday month, so I told myself it was a birthday gift to herself, that she had used the rewards card because it accumulated the best points, that she would mention it in passing. She didn't mention it. I didn't ask. The thought I kept almost having, "Linda, you need to actually look at this," kept getting interrupted by my own fierce determination to be the easy, generous, available mother I had always wanted to be. I drowned it in that determination every time it surfaced, pushed it down with both hands. In March, Brenda came to visit for 4 days. During those 4 days, 3 charges appeared: 2 restaurant dinners and one from a place called the Copper Wine Bar, totaling just over $400. I called Cassie about those. She said in a tone so breezy it barely registered as a response, "Oh, Tyler forgot his wallet. We just used yours because we knew you wouldn't mind. We'll settle up, promise." Her voice had the easy, slightly distracted quality of someone discussing something trivial, and I had found myself nodding on the other end of the phone even as something cold and uneasy settled low in my stomach. A feeling I immediately filed away under I am being paranoid and went about my evening. I had told myself I was projecting, that I was mapping the specific and familiar shape of Gerald's financial betrayals. He had quietly, methodically drained our joint savings for the last 3 years of our marriage, a discovery I had made too late and survived only barely. Onto a situation that was simply my scatterbrained daughter being bad at small debts. Families share things. This is what families do. I was not going to become the suspicious, calculating woman who kept score. The uneasy feeling stayed anyway, like a stone I had learned to carry alongside everything else. And it was still there on that Friday evening in April when my phone lit up with the Marcello's notification, and I finally stopped moving, and I finally looked. I sat with the alert for 2 full minutes without moving. I was aware of the soup in front of me, the soft murmur of the television, the tick of the clock above the refrigerator. Sounds that had been the comfortable backdrop of my evenings for 4 years, and that now felt unbearably strange, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. Then I opened the credit card app. I pulled up the full transaction history, and I sat at my kitchen table in the warm April evening, and I read every charge going back 8 months with the slow, deliberate attention of someone who has finally decided to stop being charitable. The Barcelona trip had happened in November. 2 flights, 4 hotel nights, a rental car, 3 restaurant dinners, all of it on my card, totaling just under $3,000. Cassie had come home glowing, shown me Instagram photos, said the flights had been a splurge but worth every cent. She had not mentioned that the trip had gone on my card. She'd simply used it the way you use something that belongs to you. After Barcelona, the charges had become more frequent and more various. Restaurant dinners 2 or 3 times a month, not the totals of 2 people eating quietly together, but 4-person and 6-person totals, the kind that accumulate over bottles of wine and shared appetizers and long dessert conversations when someone else is covering the bill. A December charge from a high-end florist in a neighborhood where Cassie did not live. A February boutique hotel downtown on a weekend that coincided when I checked my texts. With the weekend Brenda had been visiting, and Cassie had mentioned they might do something fun. Grocery delivery in February from a store in a zip code I had to look up. Brenda's zip code. Brenda's groceries delivered on my account. A dry cleaner I didn't recognize. A pet supply store. And Cassie did not own a pet. A wine subscription I had definitely not signed up for. Billed monthly since December, which I hadn't noticed because the charge was small and I had been trusting and not paying attention. My hands had started to tremble somewhere around the 4th month of transactions. Not the dramatic, visible shaking of panic, but the fine, persistent tremor of a person whose body has understood something the mind is still catching up to. A thin vibration in my fingers as I scrolled, as the amounts accumulated, as the total at the very bottom of 8 months of charges resolved itself into a single, stark number. $11,243. I put the phone face down on the table. I looked at the kitchen wall for a long moment, at the cream paint I had rolled on myself the first summer in the house, at the cast iron pan beside the stove, at the framed print above the bread box that Cassie had given me for my last birthday. Home is where the heart is, in rounded, cheerful font. I stared at that print for a very long time. Then I got up, took it off the wall, and placed it face down on the counter. Perhaps a small and petty gesture. It felt, in that moment, entirely necessary. I sat back down, picked up the phone, opened the app, navigated to card management, found the option I had never once had occasion to use before, freeze card, and read the confirmation prompt with the careful attention of someone making a decision they intend to stand behind completely. Freezing your card will immediately decline all new transactions. Existing authorized users will also be unable to make purchases until the card is unfrozen. I read it twice. I thought about Cassie at the table in the restaurant I had booked, probably halfway through a main course, refilling her wine glass. Completely unaware that the woman who had been told dinner was canceled was sitting in her kitchen with cold soup and a phone and 8 months of evidence. I pressed freeze. I set the phone on the counter, walked to the window, and stood looking out at the back garden for a moment. At the vegetable beds I had put in myself, at the early spring rosemary catching the last pale light. The evening was warm and mild and indifferent to everything happening inside the house. I breathed in once, deeply through my nose, and when I breathed out, something had changed. Not hot, not trembling, not the nauseating surge of a discovered betrayal, but something colder and more purposeful than either of those. The feeling of a woman who has stopped waiting to understand something and has finally understood it. I went back to the table and sat down, and I waited. My phone rang at 9:41. I had moved to the living room by then, the television muted but on, sitting in the chair by the lamp with the phone face up in my lap and the clock on the mantel ticking its steady, indifferent rhythm. I watched Cassie's name light up the screen. I let it ring 3 full times, long enough to feel the deliberateness of not answering immediately. And then I picked up. Mom. Her voice was different from usual. Usually she called me in a bright, easy register that I had always loved. The voice of someone who is genuinely comfortable and knows it. This voice was compressed, careful, tight at the edges, the voice of someone managing a situation. We're at dinner and there's a problem with the card. There's a problem with the card. Not, I know I said dinner was canceled. Not, I'm so sorry, Mom, let me explain. Just a practical obstacle in need of resolution, as though the obstacle were the point rather than the context it arrived in. The card? I said. It's being declined. I don't know what happened. Can you call the bank? The waiter is literally standing there. I noticed she said embarrassing with her tone, but not her words. The primary concern was the social inconvenience of a declined card at a nice restaurant on a Friday night, not the fact that she was sitting at a dinner she had told me 4 hours ago was canceled. "Where are you?" I asked. I already knew. I needed to hear her say it. A pause. The background noise of a crowded dining room drifted through the line. Low conversation, the soft clink of glassware, a thread of instrumental music. A warm, beautiful evening being enjoyed by people who had not been asked to stay home. "We're at Marcello's," she said at last. "The one you mentioned last week. Tyler wanted to do something for his mom. She's been going through some stuff lately." And then, very carefully, "It was just a quick thing. Last minute." Last minute. At the table I had reserved 3 days ago. "Cassie," I said, "the card isn't being declined because of a bank error." A beat. I froze it. About 20 minutes ago. And then I looked at 8 months of transaction history. I let that sit for a moment. $11,243. That's what I found. The silence that came back through the phone was different from the one before. Not the silence of someone recalibrating, but the silence of someone who has been walking across a floor they believed was solid and has felt it shift beneath them. "It's just dinner, Mom." Those 4 words, I want to describe how they landed. Not dramatically, not with an explosion of pain, but with the quiet, heavy thud of something confirmed. It's just dinner. The issue, in her framing, was my proportionality. The disproportionate response was mine. Not the 8 months, not the $11,000, not the canceled dinner that hadn't been canceled, not the fact that I was sitting alone in my kitchen while she sat at my table in my restaurant. Just dinner. She was asking me to stay in the frame of the small, single evening and not look at what surrounded it. "Tell Tyler to use his own card," I said quietly. "I'm going to bed. Sunday, 3 o'clock, my house. Come alone." I ended the call before she could answer. I did not go to bed. I poured the cold soup down the sink, rinsed the bowl with methodical, deliberate care, and stood at the kitchen window with my hands under the running water and the back garden dark outside the glass. Then I carried my wine glass to the dining room table, sat down with my phone and my laptop, and spent the next 2 hours building a record. Screenshots of every unauthorized charge organized by month with the amount, the merchant, and a note on whether I had been informed. When I added Brenda's specific charges together, the restaurant dinners across the March visit, the groceries at her address, the spa booking in her name, the hotel room on the February weekend, they totaled $763. A woman I was not related to, spending my money in the apparent belief that an arrangement had been made. At midnight, I wrote a detailed email to my attorney, Diane Hollis, who had handled the divorce with the quiet, precise efficiency of someone who had seen everything and been surprised by nothing. I laid out the situation in full. I attached every screenshot. I asked her to advise me on my options. I asked her to wait until Monday morning before responding because I didn't want to act from urgency. I wanted to be deliberate. Then I closed the laptop, went to the bedroom, and lay in the dark for a long time, with April pressing warm and soft against the windows and the slow, clarifying work of something I had been refusing to see, finally fully seen. I slept eventually, the way you do when your body is tired enough to override even a mind that won't stop moving. I dreamed of nothing I could remember in the morning. Saturday, I did the things I found most grounding. I weeded the vegetable garden in the back until my knees were stiff and my hands were dirty and my mind was quiet. I walked to the Saturday market 2 streets over and bought bread and good cheese and a small bunch of yellow tulips because it was spring and I was allowed to have flowers even in the middle of a crisis. I sat on the front porch with a coffee and watched the street and let myself simply exist in the morning without yet deciding what to do with it. In the afternoon, I called Margot. She had been my closest friend since before the divorce, a woman of extraordinary stillness, the kind of person who makes you feel, just by listening, that you are allowed to say the true thing. I told her everything. The notification, the transaction history, the total, the phone call, the 4 words. "It's just dinner, Mom." Margot listened without a single interruption, and when I had finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Linda, do you understand how much money that is?" "Yes," I said. "Have you looked at what's recoverable legally?" "I'm talking to Diane on Monday." "Good." A pause. "Have you considered that this isn't just Cassie?" I told her I had. I had been thinking about Brenda Drummond's groceries since 11:30 the previous evening, about Tyler forgot his wallet and the ease of that phrase, about the March visit and the $400 across 4 days, and the breezy, "We knew you wouldn't mind." about whether there was a difference between a daughter who had drifted gradually into taking more than she'd been given, starting with small amounts, telling herself they were temporary, letting the habit solidify until she was too far in to stop without the conversation she'd been avoiding, and a daughter who had been encouraged, directed, permitted by someone older and more practiced in the particular art of using people who are generous without requiring accountability. Those are very different situations, Margot said. I know, I said. That's what Sunday is for. That evening, Tyler sent a text at 10:15. Hey, Linda, just checking in. Hope everything's okay. Let us know if there's an issue with the card. As though I had forgotten to pay my bill. As though this were technical inconvenience rather than deliberate choice. I read it once, did not respond, and put my phone on the charger. Sunday. I had asked Cassie to come alone. At 3 o'clock, I heard a car in the drive, and when I went to the front door, I counted 2 sets of footsteps on the porch stairs. Cassie first, in her gray weekend jacket with her dark hair pulled back and her face composed in the careful expression of someone who has spent 36 hours preparing for a conversation and is not entirely sure they are ready for it. And behind her, Tyler, half a step back, hands in the pockets of his blue shirt, with the look of a man who did not want to be here and had come anyway because not coming would have been its own kind of statement. I looked at Tyler for a moment, then back at Cassie. She held my gaze for 2 seconds and then glanced away, a small, involuntary flinch that told me more than anything she'd said on the phone. I asked you to come alone, I said. I thought it would be easier if we talked together, she said. All 3 of us. I stepped back from the door. Come in then. We sat at the kitchen table, the 3 of us, in the house I had bought with my settlement money and my 20 years of work, in the kitchen with the cream walls and the cast iron pan and the rosemary on the sill and the blank rectangle above the bread box where the print no longer hung. I had made tea. I had put out 2 cups. I did not add a third. Tell me about the card, I said. What followed was one of the strangest and most exhausting hours of my adult life. Not because anyone raised their voice, but because of the specific grinding work of trying to get 2 people who are managing a story to stop managing it and simply tell the truth. It is hard work. It requires a particular patience, the kind that is not passive at all but active and steady and refuses to be distracted by the management. Cassie started with Barcelona. She had meant to tell me there had been a miscommunication. She had assumed Tyler had settled it on the back end somehow. Her voice trailing off at that last phrase, just enough that I could see she knew how unconvincing it was. I asked what settled it on the back end meant. She looked at Tyler. Tyler looked at the table. Tyler, I said, what did you tell her? He looked up. For a moment I saw something move across his face. Not guilt exactly, but the discomfort of a man who is caught between 2 things and knows that at least one of them is about to become unavoidable. I told her not to worry about it, he said. I said we'd sort it out. But you didn't sort it out. Here we are. He said nothing. Did you and Cassie make a deliberate decision at some point that my card was available for your use? A long, complicated silence. It just kind of happened, he said at last. After Barcelona. It was easier and we were going to pay it back when we got ahead financially. When you got ahead financially, I repeated slowly. $11,000, Tyler. That's how far behind you'd fallen. Cassie made a sound like a sharp intake of breath, the sound of a number becoming real that hadn't been before. Did you know the total? I asked her. No, she said. I believed her completely, and somehow that was worse, not better. because it meant she had not been managing a deliberate debt with a plan, but had been spending in that untethered, incremental way that people spend when they can see each individual purchase as small and manageable, but have stopped looking at the accumulating whole. Which meant she had stopped looking, which meant she had needed to stop looking, because looking would have required the conversation she had been perpetually postponing. "Your mother-in-law's groceries are in here," I said. "Her address, March and April, $87, the spa appointment in her name, the hotel room on the February weekend." I watched Cassie's face carefully. Did she know about the card specifically? Cassie looked at Tyler. Tyler looked at the table. "Tyler," I said, and now something sharper entered the quiet of my voice. Not raised, not hot, but precise as the point of something thin and accurate. "Did your mother know?" He answered with the particular reluctance of someone who has decided the truth is less painful than the alternative. "She knew we used it for the March dinners. She thought it was an arrangement. She thought Cassie had talked to you. She thought you'd offered." I turned to my daughter. "Did you tell her I had offered?" Cassie's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I let her think that," she said at last. "I didn't say it in those words, but I said it was fine, that you were fine with it." The kitchen was very still. Outside, a bird was singing with the cheerful, indifferent persistence of something that had no idea what was happening indoors. I looked at my daughter across the same kitchen table where she had sat 8 months ago and asked me for access to a card for emergencies in Barcelona, and I understood, with the cold clarity of a thing finally fully seen, that telling Brenda it was fine had not been careless. It had been a decision. It had moved the borrowing from the temporary, slightly guilty territory of something I'll explain later into the stable, authorized territory of an arrangement. Once Brenda believed it was an arrangement, it became one. The story had its own gravity. You couldn't untell it without admitting what it had been. "So your mother-in-law," I said, "has been spending my money for months, believing that I personally offered this to you as a family arrangement." "She doesn't know about the card specifically," Tyler began. "She knows she ate dinner on someone else's account and had her groceries delivered on someone else's account," I said, "and she was told by your wife that it was sanctioned. That is specific enough." I paused. "What else did she ask about?" Tyler told me what came next on a Wednesday when Cassie was at work and I had asked him to come alone. He was quieter without her there. More willing, I think, to let things be true without managing how they landed. He confirmed what Cassie had told me. He confirmed that Brenda, after learning about Barcelona, had said on several occasions that it was what family does, and that making a production of repaying it was unnecessary because these things sort themselves out between mothers and daughters. He confirmed that in February she had asked him questions about the house on Birchwood Lane, whether I had a mortgage, what the settlement with Gerald had looked like, whether I had updated my will. I heard that, and I let it settle, and the settling had the particular quality of a last piece clicking into place, not with satisfaction, but with the dull, clarifying weight of something you had been half knowing for a while and had been hoping not to confirm. "Your mother asked about my will," I said. Tyler nodded. He was looking at his hands. "And the house." "She said, when Cassie and I were talking about eventually buying somewhere, she said, Linda's house is lovely and she'll probably want to help you eventually, that it would be good to have those conversations sooner rather than later." The room went very quiet. I looked at Tyler, at this quiet, professionally competent man who had spent 2 years being unable to say no to his mother, not from malice, but from a structural weakness so old and so deep He probably couldn't locate where it started. And I said, very quietly, "She was planning for my house." He didn't answer. The silence was the answer. I stood up from the table and walked to the counter and stood there for a moment, looking at the rosemary in the windowsill. It was compact and green and smelling faintly of itself in the afternoon warmth, entirely unaffected by what was happening around it, occupied simply with being what it was. I looked at it for a long time. Then I turned around. "Here is what I need you to understand," I said. Not to Tyler, to Cassie, who was sitting with her hands flat on the table and her eyes red from what I knew had been several days of crying, looking at me with an expression that was neither the managed composure of Friday night nor the deflecting brightness of our normal Sunday dinners, but something raw and unguarded and genuinely frightened. I am not going to have a screaming fight at my kitchen table. I am not going to list grievances or make you feel terrible as a performance. But I am going to say this clearly once, and I need you to hear it without defending yourself until I'm finished. I looked at her steadily. What you did, not once, not twice, but systematically over 8 months on a card you had for emergencies, is theft. I know you didn't think of it that way. I know you told yourself each time that it was temporary, that you would explain it eventually, that I would understand. But you took $11,000 from me without asking, while looking me in the eye every single week and saying nothing. You told your mother-in-law that I had approved an arrangement I knew nothing about, and by doing that, you made it possible for a woman I barely know to benefit from my money and my goodwill for the better part of a year, while believing she had my blessing. That is theft, Cassie. The fact that you're my daughter doesn't change what the word means. Her eyes had filled completely. Tyler was studying the wall. "I'm not telling you this to punish you," I continued, my voice still quiet, still level, because I had decided days ago that if I was going to have this conversation, I was going to have it from a place of steadiness rather than heat, from the cold, clear part of me rather than the part that was still raw and bewildered. I'm telling you this because I spent 4 years trying so hard not to be the mother who keeps score that I made myself into someone you could take from without consequence. I made myself so available and so easy to borrow from and so afraid of the conversation where I asked to be treated honestly that I trained you not to ask. And that stops today. Not because I'm finished loving you. I am nowhere close to finished loving you. But because loving you and allowing this are not the same thing, and I am done pretending they are. Cassie said, "Mom." Just my name in the voice of someone who has no other words yet. "I know," I said, and I let it be enough for now. After they left, Cassie with red eyes and a promise to call Monday, Tyler with the carefully contained expression of a man who had spent 2 hours watching a reckoning and understood he was not coming out of it without consequences of his own. I sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time. The tea had gone cold. I didn't make more. I thought about Brenda Drummond saying that's what mothers are for, and I thought about the specific mechanism of that phrase. How it had functioned not as a statement of fact, but as a door held open, a permission issued in the tone of an observation, a direction given in the language of approval. You could say anything with that kind of ease. You could move money and houses and other people's goodwill with that kind of ease, and never once make a demand, never once raise your voice and walk away with clean hands. I thought about Brenda asking about my will. I picked up my phone and called Diane Hollis. She answered on the 3rd ring, which surprised me. It was Sunday afternoon, close to 5. And when I heard her measured, professional voice, I felt something settle in me, the particular steadiness that comes from speaking to someone whose job is to be steady. I told her I was sorry for calling on a weekend. She said not to worry and asked what had happened, and I told her in clear, careful sequence the same things I had laid out in the midnight email, plus what I had learned from Tyler that afternoon. She listened without interrupting. $11,004, she said when I'd finished. A pause. And a mother-in-law who inquired about the will and the house. Yes. Those are two separate conversations, she said. The card charges are the more immediately actionable matter. The other, the property questions, is something to document and be aware of, and not to dismiss. A short silence. I want everything you sent last night, plus the detail about the mother's comments. I want the full picture before we talk Monday. 9 o'clock? 9 o'clock, I said. On Monday morning, I did 4 things, in order. At 9, I spoke to Diane for 40 minutes. She was clear and patient and stripped the situation of its emotional weight with the practiced ease of someone who has spent 30 years turning family catastrophes into actionable facts. She walked me through civil options, explained the difference between pursuing Cassie directly and the question of Brenda's involvement, and recommended a formal documented repayment agreement as the immediate priority, combined with a letter to Brenda that established, on the record, that her benefit from the account had been noted, quantified, and was not forgotten. At 10:30, I called the credit card company and formally documented the unauthorized charges, initiating a dispute process that would create a paper record regardless of how the family situation resolved. The representative was efficient and unmoved, which I found deeply comforting. She confirmed the card was still frozen. I asked about removing Cassie as an authorized user. She walked me through it. I said I'd think about it. I meant it. At 11, Cassie called. She had been crying for a long time. I could hear it. But her voice this time had been stripped of the careful management of Friday night, and what she said, without any preamble, was, "I'm sorry, not because I got caught, because I can't believe I let it get that far. I kept telling myself I'd tell you next week, and then next week came and I told myself next week again, and now it's 8 months." A pause. I think when Brenda said that thing about what mothers are for, I let it become permission because it was easier than thinking clearly, and I knew you'd be understanding, and I used that, Mom. I used the fact that I knew you'd understand. That was the sentence that hurt most, not the total, not the months. That, the specific, honest naming of what she had done, used my understanding against me, turned my generosity into a resource, made my patience into a kind of consent. The thing about that kind of honesty is that it is the only kind worth anything, and the only kind that costs something real to offer. I believed her, loving her, and believing her, and knowing that believing her didn't fix anything were all true at the same time. And I held all 3 of them without trying to make one cancel another. "I know," I said. "I believe you." A pause. Now we figure out what comes next. At 2 in the afternoon, Diane sent me a draft of the letter to Brenda. I read it 3 times, made 2 small changes, and told her to send it. The letter was formal, precise, and legally considered. It documented, without editorializing or accusation, the charges traceable to Brenda's benefit. Her address, the dates, the amounts, the spa booking in her name, the hotel room under her name, totaling $763. It requested reimbursement within 30 days. It included Diane's name and contact information at the bottom. Brenda called Tyler when the letter arrived. Tyler called Cassie. Cassie called me. "She's very upset," Cassie said with a new quality in her voice, a careful watching distance from her mother-in-law's emotion that I had not heard before, the first hairline crack in a wall that had been solid for 2 years. "She says she had no idea it wasn't an arrangement." "I know that's what she says," I said. "The letter stands." Brenda paid the $763 into Diane's client account 12 days later. No apology, no phone call, no explanation. Just the transfer. Clean and silent and perfectly, revealingly calculated. The minimum required to close the matter, not a cent more, not a word more. The payment of someone who understands exactly what they have done and has decided that paying the minimum and saying nothing is the most controlled available exit. Diane received the payment and sent me a brief email. Received in full. Noted on file. Call if anything else develops. I read it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with a cup of coffee and the early spring light coming through the window over the sink, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't fully realized I'd been holding. The repayment arrangement with Cassie took 3 weeks to finalize. $500 a month, automatically debited, a written agreement that Diane prepared and both Cassie and Tyler signed. 22 months. Not nothing. Not comfortable. Not the flowing, informal generosity of a family that trusts itself enough not to need documentation, but the formal, structured accountability of people learning, at some cost, that trust requires the regular and unglamorous work of honesty in order to survive. I removed Cassie as an authorized user 6 weeks after the Sunday confrontation. Not in the heat of the first night, which would have been punitive, but after the repayment agreement was signed and the letter to Brenda had been sent, and I had sat with the question long enough to know my own reasoning clearly. I called the credit card company on a Tuesday morning and made the change with a quietness that surprised me. Not the sharp satisfaction of punishment, but the simpler, steadier feeling of something correctly arranged. An authorized user card was for emergencies. The arrangement had become something else. The arrangement was now over. Cassie knew before it happened. I had told her it was coming, and she had said, in a voice that was quiet and slightly tired, "I know, Mom. It makes sense." And it did. The things that make sense are not always the easy ones. Spring has been long and mild this year, the kind that extends itself as though generously, stretching the pale gold afternoons and keeping the tulips upright for longer than they have any right to be. The vegetable garden behind the house is doing exceptionally well. The tomatoes in particular, which had a slow start and seem for several weeks as though they might not establish at all, have grown into something sturdy and quietly reliable, the way things sometimes do when you stop watching them anxiously and simply tend to them with consistency. I noticed them one morning while I was out with my coffee, the way you notice something that has been happening without you, steadily, solidly, on its own terms, and felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the crisis and everything to do with the simple fact that things continue to grow. Cassie and I have dinner once a month now, not every week. The every week rhythm belonged to the version of our relationship built on the comfortable fiction that nothing difficult was happening between us, and that version is gone. What we have instead is less frequent and harder to maintain and more genuinely real. An hour or two, usually on a Sunday, sometimes at my kitchen table, and sometimes at a restaurant that she pays for herself, talking about things that are actually happening in our lives with the slightly effortful honesty of two people learning in middle age and early adulthood, respectively, that the truth between them is worth the labor of maintaining. There is a quality of attention in our conversations now that wasn't there before. We are both, I think, aware of what it costs to get here. Neither of us takes it lightly. Tyler comes sometimes. He is quieter in my presence than he used to be. A quietness I have chosen to interpret as genuine rather than strategic, because the alternative requires a vigilance that I have decided I am no longer willing to spend. He is working something out in his relationship with his mother, and that is his work to do, and I am not involved in it. Not needing to be involved in it is one of the small, unlooked-for gifts of the last several months. Margot came last Saturday with wine and bread from the market and the particular, irreplaceable comfort of her actual company. And we sat on the front porch in the long April evening and talked about nothing important for 2 hours, and it was more restorative than anything I could have planned. She asked me, at some point, whether I was angry. I thought about it honestly. I was, I said. I'm not sure angry is exactly what's left. She nodded, the way she nods when she understands something that doesn't need to be said aloud. The credit card statement comes every month, and it shows only my own charges. Coffee, groceries, the occasional dinner out, a pair of running shoes I had been putting off for too long, the monthly deposit into the Portugal Travel Fund I finally opened in February. Each line is mine, the exact size of my own life, my own choices, my own plans, and no one else's. Reading it has become something almost ceremonial, a small and quiet act of verification that things are as they should be. The charges are mine. They belong to nobody else. That is how it is going to stay. I will go to Lisbon next spring. I have started researching hotels in the Alfama, the ones with the blue-tiled facades and the views of the Tagus and the light in the early morning that everyone says makes everything look like something you would paint if you knew how. I will go alone or with Margot, and I will pay for every single cent of it myself, and it will feel like arriving somewhere I have been working toward for years without fully knowing it was a destination. The rosemary on the windowsill is thriving. I find myself looking at it more often than is strictly necessary. Out of a habit that started the night of the Marcello's notification and has never entirely left. It was there through all of it. The Friday soup, the screenshots, the waiting, the Sunday confrontation, the weeks of difficult and necessary conversations, the letter, the payment, all of it. Just being itself, compact and green and smelling exactly of what it is, not adapting to the room, not managing the people in it, not making itself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable or quieter, so no one would notice it, or more convenient so it would be easier to overlook. There is something in that. I found it later than I should have. But the thing about finding it at all is this. You stop needing to find it again. You already know where it is. You have been there before. You know the way back, and the way is shorter now, and you know exactly how it smells when you arrive.